Okay, so this is question 46 and 47 from the SAT 13 reading. And we're going to jump in and try to solve it. So this is a pretty challenging question. And it's challenging because it's one of those third questions that, so normally what we do with third questions is we start with the first question that's being asked. And then what we do is we jump into the text and try to choose a text. And then we can choose our questions. This one's going to work a little differently in that there's a little bit of back and forth, and a lot of the work is going to be done up front in the first question here. And typically these ones can be a little more challenging. There's a lot of things. Also, I just noticed that when I'm solving it, that there's certain things that I'm noticing, certain words I'm noticing, whatever. And I'm going to try to point those out so I can give you the best representation of how I solve the question, so that maybe you can apply it to yourself. I think there's probably more than one way to get to it, more than one way to solve the question. But this is a way that I think is pretty representative, like the most efficient or the best way to solve it. And it requires some skill, it requires some pattern recognition, it requires noticing some things up front. So let's just dive in and we can look at two order. So 46 says, it can reasonably be inferred from the passage that would be atypical for an individual red-headed finch to do something. So normally what we do in this situation is we jump right down to 47, and we're going to look through each of the lines, and we're going to say which line is going to tell us something that it would be atypical for an individual red-headed finch to do. And that's what we want to look for. And we might get lucky. It might be a text that very clearly tells us, like, this is something that's not normal, etc. Let's look at a couple of them. 55, 57 says, the time taken for the birds to approach the threads within one body length and to touch them were recorded over a 1 hour period. If we take a note of what the context is, this is talking about sort of the methodology. This is how they set up the experiment and what they're using to measure their experiment. Probably not the best for telling us something that is going to be atypical for an individual red-headed finch, so it's unlikely to be that answer choice. But let's just keep going. 61, 63 says the difference is not so striking as the previous experiment, but was statistically significant nonetheless. And here, let's make sure you know what the difference we're talking about is. The difference is aggressive red-headed birds showed less interest in novel objects than did black-headed birds. This one could work because it tells us something about that's typical or atypical about red-headed finches. Compared to black-headed finches, that could kind of be this one, depending if that's the direction they're going to go in. If they're going to talk about the novelty approach, approaching novel objects. 47 or C 64, 67 says these experiments were repeated after a 2-month interval, showed that different birds different in responses, but the responses of individual birds were consistent over time. This is telling us that basically, certain birds differed, but an individual bird was pretty standard. This could work. Now, here's the note. The first thing that I pay attention to is they're talking about individual birds here, and in the passage they're referencing individual red-headed finches. Now, if this question is just be atypical for a red-headed finch to do, I may not notice that, but the fact that they're saying individual red-headed finch is starting to connect with me, as well as this answer choice here, which doesn't clearly, talk about like red-headed finches at all, but it does talk about this individual bird. Moreover, and this is something that, of course, I say don't really read these, but as I'm glancing over, I do notice that a lot of the structure of these answer choices is basically doing one thing this week and another thing this week, one thing this week and another thing this week. So the question is less about the individual differences between the red-headed and black-headed finch and more about how do birds react over time, over the consistency of their behavior. So I'm starting to connect the dots and get an idea of where this question might be going. But let's look at 6971. This says red-headed birds were more aggressive than red-headed birds, but took fewer risks and were not explored. So this tells us something very clearly about red-headed birds, right? So they were more aggressive, so it would be atypical for an individual to be less aggressive. That's the direction the text is going to go in. But it's kind of hard to decide in advance our text for 47, so we should jump back into 46 and kind of see what's going on here. So A says that an individual would be atypical for an individual red-headed finch to resume feeding relatively slowly after a predator for 1 week and resume just as slowly the next. So let's start with, there's two ways to approach this here. So one is they're talking about an actual behavior of the finch, and two, they're talking about the consistency of the behavior. So we already know from the thing that we just read that we should expect that individual birds are consistent in their behavior, even if there's slight differences within the red-headed finches or between the black-headed finches. An individual is going to have pretty standard, pretty stable set of behaviors, pretty consistent behaviors. The other thing we can look at is what is typical of a black-headed finch and what's typical of a red-headed finch. So would it be atypical for an individual red-headed finch to want A, in relatively slowly after a pregnancy for 1 week and resume just as slowly the next? So first thing is the behavior is consistent. So that would be atypical because that's what we expect. The other thing is, what do they say about red-headed finches? It does say that they resume feeding relatively slowly relative to the black-headed finches. So for that reason, this is perfectly reasonable. This is what we would expect. So it's not. B says we're going to approach novel objects without hesitation 1 week, but entirely avoid them the next. First thing we should notice is that this is showing inconsistent behavior, which is making that question more making that question a little more appealing. So this might be our answer choice because it's saying you're approaching even one thing this week, another thing this week. We already know the behavior is inconsistent, so this inconsistency would be atypical. Moreover, what do we know about red-headed finches? We know that they actually, so we do know that they approach novel objects without. I'm reading it wrong. So what we do know about red-headed finches is that they approach novel objects with hesitation. It's the black-headed finches that approach without hesitation. So just this first set of behaviors would be atypical as well. So there's two things. This is a good answer, so let's keep it. C says return to feeding. Notice we got a bunch of typos. For whatever reason, the way this test is printed, there's all kinds of typos and punctuation errors in there. So just ignore those as much as you can. So return to feeding after a predator display consistently faster than another red-headed finch. So this is basically saying that two red-headed finches have different times. But what we have noticed in this little text here that we read was that different birds differed in their responses. So this would actually not be that atypical. It's pretty standard. So that would be wrong as well. He says that it would be atypical for a red-headed finch to display aggression 1 week and continue to display aggression the next. So first thing we notice is the behavior is consistent. That's not atypical. That's what we expect. Second thing, we know that red-headed finches are more aggressive than the black-headed finches. So their display of aggression is actually typical as well. So we can get rid of D. That means that we're going to leave us with B. And what's most concerning about B, or what's most obvious about B, is the fact that the behavior is inconsistent. So we want to choose the text from here that will talk about how we should expect consistency in the behavior of an individual finch. And that is this text here, which is answer choice C. These experiments were repeated, et cetera, et cetera. The responses of individual birds were consistent over time. So our answer choices are going to be B for question 46 and C for question 47.